today's session on understanding the impacts of AI on the legal profession. Welcome to Stephanie and everyone else. My name is David Malan. I'm on the computer science faculty here at Harvard, and I teach an undergraduate class called CS50 or Computer Science 50, which is our introductory course in computer science. And also with my colleague Doug, teach a course at Harvard Law School through executive education called Computer Science for Lawyers, which is also offered to the JD and LLM students here who are working through their own graduate programs. Allow me to turn over things to my colleague here, Doug.
Hello, everybody. As David said, my name is Doug Lloyd. I'm one of the co-instructors for Computer Science for Lawyers. I myself was a practicing attorney. I'm now fully back in the education space, but for many years I was a practicing attorney in Massachusetts. And at that time, David and I sort of came up with the idea for this course and presented it to HLS. And that's why many of you are here today. And we're glad to have you with us. I now currently live in Colorado, but still work very closely with David and the team on CS50 related stuff. Before I hand things back to David, just real quick, this is obviously a very buzzy topic right now, and this is going to be, I imagine many of you have a lot of questions, and because of how quickly this field is advancing, we may not have the answers immediately, but if you do have questions, we encourage you to put them in the chat. We'll also have time at the end for questions and answers, but if you put your questions in the chat whenever you'd like, I'm going to keep an eye on the chat during this first half of the lecture where David's going to be presenting, and we might be able to surface or answer some of those during the class itself. So without further ado, let me pass things back to David to get us underway.
Thank you so much. So I'm going to put myself side by side with my slides. I'm not screen sharing in the usual Zoom way. If at any point you have trouble reading anything on the slides, even if I'm big on your screen, please just mention as much in the chat and we will make some settings adjustments. Allow me first to thank some of our friends behind the scenes here with Harvard Law School Executive Education for making today possible. Thank you to a colleague of ours here in computer science, Brian Yu, who kindly helped us prepare a number of today's examples and inspiration for artificial intelligence. And for context, the course that we alluded to earlier is this one here, Computer Science for Lawyers, which one can take through the executive education program at HLS. If our colleague Rong Shin, who's also here behind the scenes with us, wouldn't mind copying and pasting these two URLs into the chat. And Rong Shin, if you wouldn't mind sharing the public URL of all of these slides, you're welcome to hang on to these slides and all of the URLs therein as we proceed today, if you might like them for reference. For context, particularly if you're wondering what exactly is involved in learning computer science, and today artificial intelligence for lawyers or those in the legal profession, here's a quick overview of what it is Doug and I explore in this particular course. We start with a look of what's called computational thinking, thinking more methodically and algorithmically, so to speak. We talk about programming languages and issues around intellectual property and what it means to write software or code. We talk about algorithms, step-by-step instructions for solving some problem, and we introduce folks to data structures, what it is the software engineers are developing, are designing, or maybe even patenting when it comes to the world of software development. And then we focus a lot of our time on the art of cryptography, keeping information secure, and cybersecurity more generally. We talk in the class about how the internet works, how the cloud works, and what the implications are for ourselves, for our firms, for our clients when we're putting more and more data out there for the whole world to see or not see. We talk a little bit about web development and how technologies like we're using right now actually work, how databases work to store even more and more data, big data at scale. And we conclude the semester with another look at cybersecurity and then more generally challenges at the intersection of law and technology. Whether you're in the US or abroad, I dare say you're familiar with the reality that the law is fairly slow to catch up with a lot of these new technologies. And as Doug said, so much has changed already in just the past few months alone. It's going to be an interesting time ahead. And so among our goals today are to really pick up where that course leaves off and focus on one particular challenge in particular, namely that of artificial intelligence or AI, which you can't really not hear about nowadays, whether you're a technophile or a technophobe or anywhere in between. So literally just yesterday, this headline was in the New York Times, for instance, where the godfather of AI leaves Google and warns of dangers ahead. And this is a gentleman named Geoffrey Hinton, who has been a force behind a lot of the academics, a lot of the research behind some of the technologies that are really now entering the mainstream. And it was perhaps noteworthy that in this same article was this line here. He is worried that AI technologies will in time upend the job market. Today, chatbots like ChatGPT tend to complement human workers, but they could also replace paralegals, personal assistants, translators, and others who handle rote tasks. It takes away the drudge work, he said, and it might take away more than that. And perhaps by a show of physical hands here or virtual Zoom hands here, how many folks in attendance today have heard of ChatGPT by now? How many of you have heard of it? All right, so almost all of the hands on my screen here are starting to come up. So that really says something, that this technology, released only months ago, has really entered the mainstream, even if you don't necessarily understand the underpinnings of it. And among our goals today are going to be two ends of the spectrum. To one, introduce you, albeit very briefly, and not to the extent that you might obtain from a whole course, to the fundamentals of artificial intelligence, so that you have a mental model for what is possible, how systems are working, and how the tools you or your colleagues are now thinking about, using, or worrying about actually work, and what kind of trajectory we might be on. So we'll go a bit into the weeds, but we'll end ultimately, to Doug's point, really on discussing some of the societal implications, particularly for the legal profession. Now, just to make this a bit more real, let me switch over to ChatGPT itself. So you should see on your screen, on my screen here, to my right, ChatGPT itself. It's just a web-based tool. If you've never used it, it's something you can sign up for on openai.com. If Rongshin, you wouldn't mind copying and pasting that link too. You can sign up for free and start to interact with it. So for instance, if I go into the chat window at the bottom of this screen, I might say something like, explain in one sentence what a lawyer should know about artificial intelligence. Perhaps that's why we're all here. Let's get it in the one sentence answer. If I hit enter, we get back. A lawyer should understand the potential benefits and limitations of artificial intelligence in their field, including its impact on legal ethics, liability, and the changing nature of legal work. So that's pretty good. How about explain it in words that rhyme instead? To be a lawyer in the know, artificial intelligence is the way to go. Know its limits, benefits, and all, and how it impacts legal work, big or small. So I did not even do these demonstrations before we started this session, which really does speak to just the expressiveness and capabilities of this kind of system, albeit in a very playful context at this point. We might now get a little more specific, where I might say, write a 1,000-word brief on the implications of AI for the legal profession. And here might be something you hand off to a colleague or paralegal or the like, and immediately we start getting paragraphs full of explanatory text, presumably answering that sort of question spot on. So we won't spend too much time on ChatGPT's examples herein, but just know that it has a very low floor and high ceiling already as to what it might be able to do and what it can, in fact, already do for us. Allow me to flip over, though, to consider some examples of this now in the wild, because it's getting so good, it's increasingly hard to distinguish it from something you might have written, a paralegal might have written, or maybe more simply today, a fourth grader might have written. So this too was a recent New York Times headline here, whereby the article presented as a sort of thought experiment, multiple bodies of text. So for instance, here are two essays written by either a fourth grader or a chat bot like ChatGPT. Does anyone want to take a look at this and then cast your vote on essay 1 first, using Zoom's icons for yes or no votes, green or red? Was essay 1 written by a human, a fourth grader? Was essay 1 written by a human fourth grader? Yes or no? Yes or no?
These checkboxes and X's might be underneath your reactions tab in Zoom if you're unfamiliar with it. You can just pop that open and it will show the check mark or the X.
Indeed. And you should see under your participants window the current tally, as well as all the yeses and nos on your screen tiles. Looks like the no's have it. We have one person who hit the arrow button, which means speed up, which I'm guessing we don't intend, but it looks like we have many more no's than yeses. And now they're coming into the chat. And Stephanie Gordon is oscillating between a couple of different responses, but it turns out that essay 1 is in fact written by an AI. So the no's have it for this one. And how about one more, Rongshin, if we could clear everyone's responses, let's go ahead and ask the same question now for essay 2. Was essay 2 written by a human? Was essay 2 written by a human, a fourth grader? Yes or no? Essay 2 written by a human, yes or no? All right, the votes are coming in. Few more yeses than nos. Same Stephanie Gordon, toggling between yeses and nos. Seems like the yeses have the momentum here, and indeed, essay 2 was written by a fourth grade child. So you might have had an instinct for that, but clearly it wasn't an easy win across all of these votes. And this isn't happening already for text alone, but even images. You might have heard of another tool from this company called OpenAI called DALL-E 2, which a few months ago made a splash by enabling you to actually generate images. And there are other incarnations of this, even more sophisticated, dare say, is one called Midjourney. If Rongshin, you wouldn't mind pasting these URLs into the chat too. And in fact, even if you've never played with these tools yourself, you might have seen this photograph around the internet in recent months, and maybe some nods of the head or some smiles if you saw this. Pope Francis looking particularly stylish and warm in this jacket. But it's perhaps worth noting that this photo is not a photo. This is generated by AI. Despite the rumors on the internet, he did not wear this particular puffy jacket and did not stroll around quite looking in this way. But this is indicative, albeit in playful terms perhaps, of just what's impossible and what's worrisome on their landscape already. For instance, here are some images generated by AI that purport to depict how the moon landing was staged decades ago. So these images, of course, are fake, but they are generated by a computer who, based on a human description, generated photographs of what the moon landing looked like if it were staged in this way. Now, at least for now, as of May 2nd, 2023, there are generally some telltale signs of why this is fake. So if you focus on some of the images, the smaller ones on the right, you'll start to notice a lot of imprecision in the human faces. Things get a little murky or a little blurry, and that's because the AI perhaps isn't quite as good at creating those images, and at least at this scale. Here's another one, for instance, of Boris Johnson dancing. The New York Times somewhat snarkily notes that it's not implausible that he was caught dancing in this way, but there are some telltale signs here too. If you zoom in or focus on his hands in the smaller image, let me go a bit further. The AI did some strange things with his human fingers, which again is sort of evidence that this is not a real photo, but something that was manufactured. So when you really start to get into the nuances, there are sometimes some telltale signs that, okay, I should not believe what it is I'm seeing on the internet or in this article. But unfortunately, those telltale signs are getting more and more subtle, and I dare say they're going to go away before long. Circling back to Pope Francis, here's one of him taking a drink in a pub here. Looks delightfully happy. Everyone's having a good time. But this too is fake. But does anyone see the tell here? What is the subtle evidence that this, in fact, was generated by AI? Marta, I think you're pointing at your ring finger. The Pope, to my knowledge, does not wear a wedding ring on his left hand. And so here was an artifact of the AI having been trained on a lot of human hands, many of which have rings on their left-hand ring finger. And of course, it then applied it to this other human who happens to be the Pope drinking in this pub, but conflating one detail with another. Skipping ahead, though, to not just generating folks that we know, but others here. Does anyone in the chat window this time, no need to vote, does anyone want to conjecture which of these two photos is of actual humans, left or right? If you want to just type it into the chat, left or right is human, left or right. Left or right, seeing a bunch of mixes. I feel like we're doing this anecdotally now. A lot of lefts, but a lot of none. I see some nuns flying about. This one's getting difficult. The one on the left is an actual human in sort of a poorly lit area. The one on the right, as perfect as that image seemed, was artificially generated by intelligence. And it can happen even at all age levels. Here, for instance, are two seemingly human faces. Both of these were now generated by AI. So even over the past few months, has there been such a marked progression of these sort of digital artifacts, no pun intended, to things being all the more compelling? And that rather speaks to just what's possible. And lastly, by way of examples, before we dive underneath the hood as to what's possible, here's one video that's gone around. It has a little bit of sound. I'm going to double click it here and play it for a few seconds so you can see perhaps a familiar face.
Real thing. I mean, it's all real.
So ironically, too, and in conclusion, nor was that real. So that was a so-called deep fake video whereby a human sort of acted that out, used his voice, but then used artificial intelligence software to change his face to look like that of Tom Cruise, to change his voice to sound like that of Tom Cruise. And here, too, in this age of misinformation already that we're in, particularly with social media, unfortunately, just to begin on sort of a negative note or a worrisome note, it's going to get even more difficult, we dare say, in the coming months, the coming years, to discern, unfortunately, what is true and what has been manufactured. So with all that said, there are some positives. And indeed, among our goals today will be to focus ultimately on some examples. And feel free to chime in via the chat as to examples you see more positively as to what's possible when it comes to use of AI. But some of these we're already familiar with, even though nowadays they probably seem a little dull. So classification, taking in as input, for instance, emails in your own inbox and classifying them, whether they should stay in your inbox or perhaps be marked as spam, is actually something that's been happening for years. And thankfully, Gmail and Outlook have been getting better and better and better at this, but they've been using artificial intelligence because unfortunately with spam, there's not usually a keyword like spam in the message that makes clear that it's in the inbox or destined for spam. So we need to learn or figure out what it is spam looks like, even if we've never seen a particular message before. Another one that which computers and phones are getting even better at is handwriting recognition, taking my messy scratch of penmanship and actually converting it to the proper text and detecting it. Android phones, iPhones are getting even better at this. But of course, they've not been trained on your handwriting specifically. They've been trained on humans' handwriting more generally. And so we're sort of already able to infer or extrapolate what someone else's handwriting might look like so we can recognize it too. Recommendation systems. If you have Netflix or Disney Plus or Paramount Plus or any of these streaming services, you probably see in the menus quite often other movies, other shows that you might like. Well, those too are evidence now of artificial intelligence in the wild, inferring from things you've watched, inferring from things you've upvoted, what else you might like as a result. And then, of course, with Siri, Alexa, Google Assistant, or the like, being able to ask in natural language, so to speak, various questions and getting back responses is increasingly possible as well. Now, among the earliest examples, perhaps, of artificial intelligence were some of the games that you and I grew up with, whether it's playing on paper pencil or even more digitally in the form of video games, tic-tac-toe being one of them. And then there was this game, arguably one of the first video game or arcade game some decades ago. This thing is called Pong, and the game was simple. Two people on one side get to move their paddles up and down, and the goal is to bounce the ball left to right, ideally to get it past the other person's paddle. Now, just thinking about this, if you wanted to implement an AI or a CPU, central processing unit, that is a computer, so that you didn't need two friends to play this kind of game, but just one human on one side, so that the computer could play on the other side, how might we go about implementing this? Anyone want to raise their Zoom hand and offer a thought verbally? How could you design a system, even if you're not a computer person, not a programmer, like what would the AI have to do or have to know in order to win this game against you? Daniel, do you want to chime in?
Yeah, sure. So I guess it would have to learn from kind of expert players' movements to understand kind of, so for example, FIFA is a great example. I think there's a mode, or the way they do it is they look at kind of the best in the world and how they play against each other. And they will kind of learn those moves and apply it to the CPU.
So
how they
very
do it
true.
at the different levels of difficulty, I don't know.
Quite fair. Very true. And thank you for offering that. But I dare say that's an even more sophisticated answer than we need. What's nice about a lot of games is that they're so well defined as to what you can do. I mean, literally in this game Pong, you can go up or down on the left or right. And given that, I dare say that the simplest of AI would really be for just the computer player to just always move in whatever direction the ball is going. The computer doesn't have to think about it. The computer doesn't have to anticipate anything. The moment it sees the ball coming at it, it just has to shoot to the top or the bottom or somewhere in between. It's actually very deterministic, and we don't even need to learn from good humans. We can literally just track the ball in this case. And there's other games like this. So tic-tac-toe, for instance, can actually be solved, even though kids certainly don't think about it this way, using an artificial intelligence technique that you might think of as decision trees. And you might already be familiar with this idea from game theory or other domains. But in the context of tic-tac-toe, for instance, where the goal is to solve a board that looks a little something like this, if unfamiliar, getting 3 X's in a row or 3 O's in a row, either up, down, left, right, or diagonally, well, you can actually distill this into some form of an algorithm. And so, for instance, one algorithm that's worth knowing a little something about is called Minimax. And it's nice because it's relatively simple and accessible. So Minimax is all about minimizing something and maximizing something else. And this is a very common technique, at least in the most simple of artificial intelligences, for solving some problems. So for instance, let me contextualize this. In the game of tic-tac-toe, and let me stipulate that internationally, most of us probably know tic-tac-toe. But again, if not familiar, the goal is to either get 3 O's in a row or 3 X's in a row, up, down, left, right, or diagonally. Here might be 3 possible scenarios of tic-tac-toe games in progress. And let me propose that we should think about these games as follows. On the left, we have 3 O's in a row, and they're highlighted in green because that person has won. Let me propose that if O wins, that board should be given a score of -1. By contrast, on the right, if X wins, per the 3 green X's, let's give that board a score of 1. And if nobody wins, it's a tie, like in the middle, let's give that board a score of 0. And we do this by labeling these outputs so that we can actually kind of analyze the data and work through this kind of problem quantitatively. If we are the computer trying to play against a human, we need some way of modeling this world of tic-tac-toe that ideally doesn't involve pictures and lines and arrows, but ultimately just numbers. So this is the simplest numbers we can use, -1, 0, and 1, respectively. So for instance, let me claim now that according to this definition in these green O's and these green X's, I dare say the goal of X in life is to maximize its score. It wants to get a score of 1. But the goal of O in life is going to be to minimize its score, getting -1. And that's kind of a very boring distillation of what tic-tac-toe really is at the end of the day that you and I play much more graphically. So let's consider this board. This board is already solved and X appears to have won already. And so here then this board would have a value of 1 because X wins. Now let's rewind a bit. Suppose that we're playing in the middle of playing tic-tac-toe and the board currently looks like this. So there are 2 positions that haven't been played. And let me propose that it's O's turn now to actually make their move. So O gets to choose, according to this game, where they're going to play their next move. And obviously, how many different choices does O have here? I mean, literally 2. It can either go in the top left or in the bottom middle. But how do we decide what move O should do? Kids generally probably just guess or have some generic strategy, but we can figure this out computationally. We can map this to a computer problem. So for instance, if it is O's turn, let's ask ourselves, well, what is the value of this board currently? Is it going to be negative, in which case O is going to win, or is it going to be positive, in which case X is going to win? Well, let's consider this as the 2 possible routes. We can either create this sort of decision tree, kind of like a family tree, but representing different paths you can take in your decision-making process. We can either put the O in the top left corner, per the board at the left, or we can put O in the bottom middle, per the O to the right. But if we now continue this train of logic, on the left-hand side of this picture, let's ask ourselves, what is the value now of the tic-tac-toe board at the bottom left? Well, we can't answer that yet. We should consider what are the possibilities now if it's going to be X's turns next. Well, X, of course, has it easy. X only has 1 choice. And if X goes in that 1 remaining spot, then of course X is going to win. And so according to our definition earlier, where we simplified the world of tic-tac-toe into -1, 0, and 1, maybe via the chat window here, what is the value of this tic-tac-toe board at the bottom of my screen now, where X has already won? We give that, yes, indeed, as Stephanie has noted, a value of 1. Now we can work our way backwards. If we know that the value of that board is 1, and that was the only move X could make logically, then we can rewind in time and assume that, well, you know what, by transitivity, the previous state of the board that had a blank in that bottom middle spot, that was also value 1, because it inevitably leads to a situation where X wins. So that's giving us a bit of information if I'm trying to strategically think a couple steps ahead. And so let's now jump to the other side. If I rewind, if O goes into that bottom middle location, well, what happens next when it's X's turn? Well, X obviously can only go in the top left, but notice that X has not won and O has not won. So again, if I may, via the chat, what is the value of this board at the bottom right of my screen? It's going to be 0 because it's a tie. And so again, by transitivity, that means that the value of this board is 0. So the value of the board above it, from which we came logically, is also 0. And now here's the sort of icing on the cake. If the whole point of this thought exercise was to consider where should O go when it is O's turn, we need to ask ourselves, well, what is the value of that topmost board going to be? What value would O prefer? That we get back a value of 1 or 0? Put another way, which branch of the tree is O, if it's a rational human being or computer in this case, going to do? Ideally not 1, because 1 means X has won. O is going to accept the fact that, I can't win this game, but I can at least prevent the other kid from winning, the person playing X. So long story short, then with tic-tac-toe, if we come up with a way of even modeling this human problem as something very computational in nature, very simplistic, zeros and ones and negative ones, we can then start to reason about things. And let me just claim that if we rewind now and don't just consider the last 2 moves in tic-tac-toe, but the last 3. So notice what I've done. I've sort of zoomed out on a bigger game tree here. And what you see here on this tree is that there's 3 possible moves, and we won't go into the weeds of this. Suffice it to say that as soon as there's a 3rd possible move left, or a 4th or a 5th, if you think about this in your mind's eye, this decision tree is just getting bigger and bigger and bigger because there's so many more possible directions we can go in. We can go X here, we can go O here, or in some other direction. And at the end, this invites the question then, well, just how hard is tic-tac-toe for computers to solve? Well, does anyone want to estimate how many possible ways are there to play tic-tac-toe on just a 3x3 grid? You know, mom and dad never told you this as kids, like how hard this game theoretically was, even though there is a strategy that's optimal. Anyone in the chat want to conjecture? I see 36. Anyone want to underbid that or overbid? I see 250. I'm going to spoil it. There are 255,000 different ways to play tic-tac-toe based on the sheer permutations of who can go where and in what order. Now that's big, certainly for kids and even for you and me in the room here, but it's solvable by computers, right? We have more computational power in our iPhones and Androids nowadays than they did when they actually landed on the moon decades ago. 255,000 possibilities is nothing. Like any Mac, PC, or phone can solve that these days. But what about other games? How about chess? And in fact, even if you're not a chess player, the first 4 moves, like just where the pawns or a few of the other pieces can go, in chess alone, even if we only consider 4 levels of the decision tree, there are 288 million possible ways to start a game of chess combinatorically. And this is where now things are getting painful for computers. You probably heard of Watson and Deep Blue and so forth. There are computers that try to solve this problem, but as soon as we're talking millions or billions or quadrillions, now we're starting to outstrip the computational abilities of today's computers. And this is now why we need truly artificial intelligence that's not just doing what we tell it to do step by step and making perfectly logical decisions. We really do need it to learn more dynamically from data. So before we consider some real world applications now of AI, I wanted to give you a tour through some high level concepts in AI that you're probably going to hear all the more about over time. And even if you don't care ultimately to understand things at that lower level, These are going to be the building blocks for the coming few years that really underlie ChatGPT version 4, version 5, and onward for some time. So reinforcement learning is one technique in the world of artificial intelligence that allows a computer to dynamically figure out how to solve some problem when it's not as simple as just trying a nice big decision tree, because that tree might just be too big to think through in advance, much like for a human. So for instance, here is a maze that a computer might want to navigate. The yellow dot represents the computer and the green square represents the goal. So it's some kind of maze. But much like in childhood, if you ever played The Floor is Lava, you want to avoid falling into a lava pit, maybe represented in red. So for instance, if I just want to explore this world, I might notice that there's 3 lava pits somewhere in this world. But if I've never found the path before, and if you think of this not when the bird's eye view, but being the human on the ground trying to decide to go left, right, or some other direction, the best we can do out of the gate is explore. So for instance, the yellow dot might move here and it fell into the lava pit, so it should be penalized. And here is the reinforcement and reinforcement learning. It's bad enough that you just fell in a pit of lava, you sort of lost your life in a video game, but that's sort of a negative. So negative reinforcement saying don't do that again because clearly it led to a bad outcome. Thankfully, in the computer world or video games, you can typically start over with another life. So let's do that. But let's remember now, per this darker red line that I drew to the right of the yellow dot, that I should not go that way. I want to reinforce the fact that I should not repeat past mistakes. So this time I'll go up, and then maybe I'll go to the right. And then maybe, oh, darn it, now I went down because I didn't realize that going down would lead me to that same lava pit. So let's reinforce that with a penalty and remembering with this dark red line that, I should not do that again. And if we continue this logic, I can continue to explore, occasionally falling into lava pits, but learning that I therefore should not do that again, once more. But eventually, hopefully, through really trial and error and enough free lives in arcade game terms, I'll eventually make my way to the goal. But if you were following along the path that I happened to take there, let me do it once more, same exact path. And now I've noted in dark green where I should go. An artificial intelligence that's been trained using reinforcement learning should ideally follow those same steps thereafter because it knows it's always going to succeed. It never again needs to fall in a lava pit. But does anyone want to offer in the chat or via a virtual hand what you noticed about the path I took? And is this really the most artificially intelligent path? Or could I have done better? I'm seeing in the chat, not the most direct, not the most efficient, too long. And indeed, there is a much shorter path. Let me rewind. I didn't need to go around and about in this way. I could have pretty much made a beeline from bottom left to top right, avoiding the red, but there is a shorter path. And so there's this general idea too in the world of artificial intelligence, of whether you should explore or you should exploit. And the idea here is that if you've already learned something about your world, for instance, these lava pits and these safe spaces that you can walk on, well, then you should probably exploit that knowledge and always take that same path again. Honestly, I'm the same way in a restaurant. If I go to a new restaurant, I find a dish I like, even if there's better dishes on there, I will never know because I stay within my comfort zone and I exploit the knowledge that that chicken dinner I had the other night was really good and I always get the same chicken dinner. However, there's a principle in artificial intelligence, and frankly in the culinary world, that you should occasionally explore instead, using some epsilon value, like some small probability. You know what, darn it, today I'm gonna get the salad instead, because who knows, maybe that salad is really good and much better, and I'll find a shorter path to the goal. And so randomization in the world of artificial intelligence is really huge, and it does model the sort of whims that you and I as humans might occasionally have, like, all right, today I'll try something new. You don't say it that often, but so long as you say it once in a while, you will learn something new. You'll find a shorter path. You'll find a better dish on the menu. Now, separate from reinforcement learning, there's deep learning, which in and of itself doesn't really hint at anything other than it's a more powerful way, a lower level way of trying to learn information about the world. And it's very much related to what you might have heard described nowadays as neural networks, taking the human brain and the neurons that we have in our head, and maybe from high school biology class, that somehow allow us to communicate and to learn and to behave in human ways. Well, if we simplify this world of neurons and think of them not as these biological things that can interconnect and form memories and so forth, let's just simplify them as a computer scientist would into like a single dot. So this simple white and blue circle here represents a node, or if you prefer biologically, a neuron. But what we're going to use that neuron for is to figure out some information about our world. And it turns out that if we think of the neuron as being an input on the left, the goal in artificial intelligence is to make decisions, to figure something out, an output on the right. And the hard part, the magic of OpenAI and the technologies you and I have been playing with in recent months is to figure out, like, what does that arrow look like? What is the math function that gets me from left to right in that direction that logically gives me the answer I want? And often there's multiple inputs. So for instance, here, there might be 2 inputs, and therefore we have 2 or 3 parameters that we need to figure out dynamically. But let's keep it simple. Suppose the problem in the world that we want to solve is just this. We've got like an XY plot, so like a Cartesian plane here, with red and blue dots. And the goal is to predict ultimately whether a dot is going to be blue or red based only on its XY coordinates. So this is a very sort of distillation of what might be a more real world example here. Now, what's the best way to distinguish red dots from blue dots at the moment? Well, honestly, I'm going to figure out a function, a math function that just draws a straight line, because clearly that draws a line in the sand. That means that blue is to the left and red is to the right. So deep learning and a neural network would essentially figure out automatically, without a human getting out their paper and pencil, would figure out what the math function is that draws that line between the red dots and the blue dots. So if we see another dot tomorrow, we can predict that if it's on the left, probably blue. If it's on the right, it's probably red. And so really the neural network on the left-hand side here represents X and Y as our inputs, represented by these 2 neurons, if you will, or nodes. And the output node there represents the output, a prediction. Is this dot tomorrow going to be red or blue based on its XY coordinates, for instance? So if you're the math type, what we're trying to figure out dynamically is like a formula that looks like this. AX plus BY plus C ideally is greater than 0. And if we can figure out some parameterization of A value, a B value, and a C value that makes that mathematical expression true, greater than 0, we can conclude that, okay, that's going to be red. And if our A and B and C give a value that's negative, you know what? We're going to predict that that is blue instead, red or blue respectively. So again, it's no accident that computer scientists like to distill even the most complicated ideas into simple outputs, yes or no, 1 or 0, spam or actual email, because it helps us simplify the world and also quantize it, sort of dealing with things more mathematically. Now, over time, we might learn that, okay, this simple vertical line was pretty naive. We shouldn't stick with just this vertical line, because if there's 3 dots or 4 dots or more, we might need to figure out a new slope, a new A and B and C. And eventually, we're not going to get it perfect, especially if we're using a straight line in this discussion. But most of the time, the blue dots are now to the left. Most of the time, the red dots are to the right. And therefore, we can use this parameterization ultimately to have learned. And if we now sort of take a step back, these neural networks aren't as simple as just an X and a Y and an ABC. It's feeding outputs into more inputs, into more inputs, into more outputs, and so forth. And this is where really neural networks get their name. And you can think of other examples, like humidity plus pressure should ideally give you a prediction for rainfall. Advertising plus the month of the year should give you sales estimates for that year, and so forth. And we can see this then, of course, in examples like we've seen before, even classifying something like spam and the like. And now, and as a final building block, before we turn things over to Doug and applications thereof, we've of course talked about what we've just looked about are generally examples of supervised learning, where along the way, there was some human saying initially, this is spam, this is not spam, learn from my example, where humans are tagging or labeling the data in some way. But that only gets us so far. There's another category of machine learning that we'll end on here called unsupervised learning, where you just have a massive corpus of text, like all of the websites in the world, all of the Wikipedia articles, all of the information we as humans have generated, and we just want to run it through some kind of neural network and just let the computer figure out what the patterns are, the speech patterns, the writing patterns in English or anything else. And what's been compelling about ChatGPT is that it, more so than past algorithms, is really good at examples like this. Here's a simple paragraph. Massachusetts is a state in the New England region of the northeastern United States. It borders on the Atlantic Ocean to the east. The state's capital is ... Complete that sentence. Now, if our AI had mined all of human knowledge via the internet or books or the like, up until recently, it was actually really hard for computers to realize that when we use this noun, state, in another sentence altogether, it's actually referring back to that first proper noun, Massachusetts. This is obvious to you and me as humans, but for many years, it was really hard for computers to make those associations when it wasn't all in the same breath, all in the same sentence. And this is why like customer service bots and such things are so bad generally, because they're only looking at a few words or the same sentence, not a whole paragraph of text that you might have written. So what OpenAI and ChatGPT have done is essentially take sentences like these on the internet and elsewhere, chop them up into, say, individual words, assign numbers to those words, like where are they relatively in the sentence, word 1, word 2, word 3, and so forth. And just by analyzing so much language, figure out, well, how often does the word is come after Massachusetts? How often does state refer to Massachusetts and so forth? And ultimately build up a crazy large neural network where all of these words, all of these associations are inputs, and the output ultimately is what we'd call a large language model. Some very fancy, very large neural network that sort of represents English knowledge, the English language knowledge. And their specific implementation of this is called a generative pre-trained transformer, which is computer science speak for just a large language model's implementation. And we know it more colloquially now as ChatGPT, but the G and the P and the T have been there all this time. But what's nice about these models is that they're very general. They're not for specific problem domains. They can be fine-tuned for specific professions, for medicine, for gaming, for the legal profession, as by feeding it a whole bunch of law books and now asking it to extrapolate from this fine-tuning of knowledge the question I have about my very own field. And so allow me to stop sharing here and turn things over to Doug now to consider things at indeed that higher level legal language.
All right, let me get my slideshow up here. It's picking up just where we left off. Can everybody see this hopefully now? This recommended reading I have up there. Yes, hopefully. All right. ly/lawgpt.
The slide's still loading. Sorry, Doug.
About
Doug, it is still saying start. Do you want to stop screen sharing and try once more? Otherwise, I'll put mine up instead. Okay, there we go. Doug's back. Sorry, technical difficulties.
I think I might still be here.
You're back. You're back. Do you mind stopping and starting your screen sharing again?
Yeah, I might need to.
I'm sorry, y'all. Doug, you froze for me. While Doug fixes this, let me take advantage of the moment just to see if there's any questions from the group. Let's give Doug a minute or two to get back on Zoom here. But indeed, Colorado Wi-Fi is to blame. Please feel free to raise your hand virtually if you would like. Let's see. Marco, question from you? Oh, I lost you, Marco. Let's see. Marco, do we have Marco on the line? I'm seeing reports of other technical difficulties in the chat here. Marco, we lost Marco. Other questions from the group while we await Doug's return here. Oh, there we go, Doug.
Okay, I'm gonna attempt not to share the slideshow presentation. I think we're getting a little overwhelmed by the number of people here. All right, so sorry about that, folks. We'll try and move a little quickly through this section. So like I said, the recommended reading, I recommend taking a look at this. We'll post the link in the chat. I wanted to highlight 3 areas where GPT and its ilk seem to be currently creeping into the legal space. I think these issues I'm going to surface, I'm not going to have the answers for. None of us are really going to have the answers for, because you've seen just following the news how quickly this evolves. But the first one is AI is actually acting as attorneys. Some of you may have seen this story recently, where a college student who got a parking ticket, there was a procedure for the student to get out of the ticket by basically writing to their magistrate to see if they could get it taken care of. They weren't really comfortable doing that. They decided, oh, I have a little bit of experience with GPT, and GPT wrote the letter to get them out of it. Basically, the student only had to plug in the amount of the ticket and the date that they got it. And this letter, so again, kind of written by an attorney, written by a computer acting as an attorney, succeeded in getting this case effectively dismissed, which opens up a couple of questions. Now, again, I don't have the answers to these questions. I don't think any of us really have the answers to these questions. Just sort of things to start thinking about as we see, AI evolving, the steps that David sort of walked through earlier, where we were seeing how things evolved over time and how language models have gotten better and better, how image generation has gotten better and better. I think as we go into the next few months, the next few years, we're going to see these tools become indiscernibly distinct from humans. So are things like this are allowing people to make use of these tools? Is this a democratization of the law? Is this something where we're taking away this idea of the distinction between an attorney and a client and sort of giving clients the ability to act as their own attorneys? Are there elements of misrepresentation here? This may be more of a problem for attorneys who use GPT than clients who use GPT, but should we be saying that we wrote something if we didn't actually write it? Or is this just an evolution of tools like spell checkers or grammar checkers that you may be familiar with from Microsoft Word or other word processing software, where this is just a tool that's helping us out? A perhaps more dramatic implementation of this was a situation back in January, where the founder of a startup that was doing it's called Do Not Pay, tried to give a client, under the guise of it being an assisted listening device, like headphones, an opportunity to defend the client defend themselves effectively in court, only reading back exactly what was piped in to their GPT-fueled tool. So the software would hear what was happening in the court, translate it into text. The text would be processed by GPT, and immediately the client, or individual in this case, would read back literally what was being said. They were not supposed to do anything different. This came very close to actually happening, but was stopped at the last minute because California, which is the state where this was going to take place, their state bar association threatened to refer the founder of this company to the local district attorney's office, claiming that they were engaging in the unauthorized practice of law. So some questions to think about, which maybe we can save for discussion at the very end here. Is this a legitimate position to take? If it is, who do you charge? Do you charge the founder? Do you charge the individual developers of the tool beside the company? Is this a case where this was really still just self-representation? There were no actual attorneys involved. Is it good for attorneys to be challenging the evolution of these tools? As we've said, and I'm sure all of us are very familiar with, the law is very, very slow to catch up with technology. If, as attorneys, we are using our ability and our savvy in the courts to try and prevent this kind of technology from entering the court, does that have a chilling effect on the development of the technology? And could it be a force for good? Like, we have a very overworked public defender system. I'm not suggesting that we should replace the entire public defender system with chatbots, right? Like, obviously that's not the way to go. But there are also lots of free legal aid services that show up in courts. Is this the kind of thing, tools like this that can rapidly process live dynamically what's happening in a court, is this a good thing? Is this necessarily threatening to the industry. So again, questions just to start thinking about. One other thing I wanted to point out about do not pay, which I love, is things you can do with do not pay. Sue anyone. Just sue anybody. This is on their website. I just think it's very funny. But it is a tool that is still being developed. And granted, this California case did not happen, but it's still something that can be used to help individuals with their legal issues. So these are just two of the very recent examples of AIs purporting to act as quasi-attorneys or something like that. Perhaps a more interesting use case for us as practitioners are AIs as co-pilots. So these are tools that use GPT analyzing different texts to make suggestions for us to make our practice better. So for example, here's a tool called Spellbook. And the idea behind Spellbook is it ingests a bunch of different text, different contracts. So maybe it's connected to your firm's document database, for example, analyzing all the contracts that have been written by all the attorneys in the last 20 years. It's connected to case law databases, statutes, and so on. And you can train it or ask it to rewrite contracts for you. Say you wrote a contract in California, but you need it to now be compliant with New Jersey law. You can ask it to rewrite this for you to change all of the relevant California terms to relevant New Jersey terms and whatever situations might be involved in that, sort of the nuances of the difference in the law. So this is a tool that we could use to expedite our drafting of different materials, which could be a benefit to the client, right? Because we're spending fewer hours doing something, though, is that something we should be doing? Other tools like this, Harvey is another very new one. Harvey, for example, this is on their website, or sorry, this is from an article about Harvey. Tell me what the differences are between an employee and an independent contractor in the Fourth Circuit. You can ask it that kind of question, and it will go through and analyze the case law and analyze relevant law review articles about it, and it will give you an answer. Or tell me if this clause is a violation of the law, and if it is, rewrite it. So again, it's sort of acting as a co-pilot here. It's somebody in the side seat with us. We still probably should be verifying their work. Is this an appropriate use of GPT? Would you yourself consider using tools like this? And to what extent would you do so? Are they sort of a digital intern? I remember when I was in law school, I spent my summers interning at firms. And these are the kinds of things that I would be asked. Tell me what the differences are. Can you rewrite this clause? Is a tool like this a digital intern? How aggressively should you check its work? And where would you feel comfortable drawing that line? So again, seeing what we've seen about how these tools evolve and how they're becoming difficult, more and more difficult to distinguish human from non-human. To what extent do these tools have a place in our industry? And then lastly, I want to surface just a couple of new, interesting, quirky challenges that might come up because of the proliferance of AI. The first, so you've been defamed by a chatbot. So as we've seen, there are definitely some examples where the AI gets it wrong. It might make a mistake playing tic-tac-toe. It might output incorrect information. It does still happen. We saw that most concretely with the pictures where it was messing up people's fingers and hands, for example. In this case, the chatbot, somebody was asking a question about something, and the chatbot called out a whistleblower as being the person who actually was involved in a bribery scandal, but it was actually the whistleblower. And so effectively, this chatbot is writing something that is defamatory of someone. It's not true because it was interpreting its data and it made a mistake, which again is going to happen a lot with these AI models. What happens here? What happens in a situation like this? Who is responsible if the person who is defamed by this, if this becomes public, decides to sue, right? Like that's a weird question. Is the AI legally responsible? Seems kind of unlikely. Is it the person who typed the question in the first place? Is it the person who designed the software in question? Sort of, it's kind of an interesting open question, I think. Who is to blame? Another interesting one I saw recently was just 2 weeks ago, a software developer who wrote, or who didn't write, but asked GPT to write it a Chrome extension, so Google Chrome, the web browser, an extension for, I don't even remember what it was for, but the AI wrote the entire thing for them, right? A couple hours. The developer, quote unquote developer, sold it and made money off of it. So who owned that? Who owned that piece of software? Is that does that kind of fall under agency law or independent contractor law, where, well, I contracted you to make this for me, so I own it, but it's not a human, right? So we sort of have this, we have ways to handle this when it's employee, employer, or independent contractor or agent. But what if that agent is not a human being who is potentially capable of asserting its own rights? Who owns that? Should AI generated code, that's probably relying on open source material, have certain license types attached to it? Should they automatically be open sourced? Should they be considered copy left, which is basically anything I write, if you use it, all of your stuff also has to be made publicly available under an open source license? Who's responsible when things go wrong for AI generated software? Warranties or fitness for a particular purpose? Or what if it runs afoul of someone's intellectual property rights, right? Like AIs have access to databases of code. Maybe some of that code that they are accessing is under one kind of license versus another. And the way the AI uses that code violates the license that it's drawing from, right? So maybe it was an open source license and now this code is being incorporated into commercial use, but it's not been open sourced itself. Who's liable in that situation? And is the same true for AI designed products, like physical things, like maybe it physically manufactures or comes up with the blueprint for a chair, for example, and then something goes wrong with that chair? Who's responsible for that? That one's probably a bit of a cleaner question. And then, of course, there's the big one, which is, what are the ethical issues, right? To what extent do we need to disclose that we're using AI? Should we disclose that we're using AI? If we use AI, we use it but we're going to spot check everything anyway. Is that something that needs to be mentioned, and so on? I realize I had to go through that quickly. I apologize that Zoom threw me off there at the end, but we are just now scratching the surface, right? We are just at the cusp of what I think is going to be an explosion of this in the next, we've seen a huge change from GPT-3 to GPT-4 in the last 3 months, right? The quality is indisputably better with GPT-4, and now all of these other tools are kind of arising, Copilot, the new Bing, and so on, to step up. Where are we going to be in 6 months? If we do this session again in 6 months, it's going to be very, very different. We're running a bit over time. I just want to put a couple of final thoughts out there for you to consider as you walk away from this session. And then after that, Dave and I will stick around for a little bit for anybody who wants to stick around for questions. Is use of AI something that is, or is discussion of AI something that is even happening in your firm or organization? Or is it one of those things that's like, oh, we'll get to it when we get to it? Do you think now that it should be? If you are having these discussions, are the discussions generally positive? Like, this is something that can help us, this is something we can use, which is sort of what we saw in the AI as Copilot, what I was trying to describe as AI as Copilot. Or is that discussion generally negative? This is something we need to be afraid of. This is something that is bad. That would be more in the context of, are AIs going to replace us as attorneys? No, not yet. But who knows what's going to happen in the next few years of development. I think we're still a long ways away from that, but I think that these tools are starting to get more and more quote unquote human. Have you used any of these tools? And if you haven't, I actually really do encourage you to do so. OpenAI, which was shared earlier in the chat, you can sign up with a Google account, or you can sign up for an account and just play with it. I highly recommend it. It's very interesting. It's very enlightening. If it's not something that you see every day, just having experience with it also helps you be able to have those conversations with your clients. If you ever are in a situation where, like, your firm is going to start using AI, and you can, speak and discuss about what that would look like for the client? And are you personally feeling optimistic or pessimistic about where this technology is going? So not necessarily whether the discussions you're having writ large are good or bad. How do you feel about it? Does it make you nervous? Does it make you feel like this is something that you can use to step up your representation of clients? I think at this point, we're going to turn it open to questions. I know we're over time. Thank you again for bearing with me in my technical situation there. And we'll put up our emails as well for any questions that might come up afterwards. If we run out of time or if you want to ask us something later, feel free. If you put CSL in the subject line, that would be very helpful just because it flags that automatically in my inbox so it doesn't get lost. I do get a lot of emails. So yeah, thank you for that. Again, sorry that I had to speed through that at the end, and we'll turn it over to questions now.
Thank you all so much for joining. Do indeed feel free to drop off at this point. We'll share the recording and slides and URLs thereafter. Thanks so much for joining, though. And Doug and I will indeed stick around now. Great to see everyone. As for questions, feel free to raise a virtual Zoom hand. And if you type something into the chat that you would like to resurface, feel free to raise your hand or retype it into the chat just so that we see it anew.
I'm actually going to resurface one that I wrote down earlier from Kiran, who I don't know if is still here, asked, how does this affect the trust factor of the internet now that there is more AI generated material? That's a very interesting question. I think it's funny because I grew up at a time where the internet was sort of new. And so I was taught to be very skeptical of the internet. Like, I remember when Wikipedia was like, you don't cite Wikipedia, you don't trust Wikipedia. And so I think it somewhat depends on how skeptical you are. I think in general, it's always good to be skeptical of what you read on the internet, whether it's a biased source thing, whether it's AI generated material and so on. I do think it is going to negatively, this is a personal opinion, I do think it is going to negatively impact how we can trust things on the internet, particularly in the context of images and deepfake videos, which I think that we have long relied on as like this like pics or it didn't happen, right? If you can't trust the pictures themselves anymore, I think that's going to start rooting a lot of skepticism in how we engage with and consume content on the internet. That's a personal opinion, though.
Again,
I'm gonna pop open the chat and see if there are some other messages here. When my Zoom crashed, I had all the windows open and everything closed. So let me just scroll back here for a moment.
Feel free to raise a virtual hand in the meantime, but I'll defer to Doug on the chat questions. Let's see, Marco, we saw your hand earlier. You want to try again?
Yeah. I'll try again. Good day, and well done with the presentation. It's amazing. So my question would be, with the current advancement of AI, do you think that there would be sufficient adjustments regarding the copyright laws with regards to the use of AI generated tools?
Doug, shall I defer to you on that?
I'm going to say yes, but the question is when. We are notoriously slow in responding to technology as a field. And so I do think there need to be those changes. I don't know what those changes look like. I think we're at least optimistically 3 years away from any sort of change that affects this, because I just don't think that the people in the position to make these changes fully understand the implications yet of these tools and how they're going to impact society. I don't think we, even as computer science professionals, have a full understanding of this ourselves. But I think in light of that, we're still several years away from changes that answer these burgeoning questions. I do think it will happen. I just don't know when, or if the changes that are made are the right ones to make, or are they just band-aids for, latching onto an extension of how we would handle this for agency-related interactions, for example. I'll surface a question from the chat for David. What great ideas are there from other industries that legal innovators can learn from within the legal context? So this is from Daniel, but what other industries, perhaps that you're familiar with, are good jumping off points for lawyers to sort of internalize?
Yeah, it's a good question. A couple of people asked in the chat earlier about examples too. Thus far, I think drafting things as starting points in any industry, I think, is kind of compelling. I think you have to be learned in the field right now to be able to discern if what ChatGPT is telling you is in fact accurate or not. But the reality is that it can save a lot of time already. Doug alluded to it being used, or similar technology being used Copilot-wise for programming code. And even I have used this a couple times because there's certain types of programming code in the software industry that honestly is just not intellectually interesting to write. Like the code's got to be written and it's customized enough for you that you can't just use someone else's existing code, but it's just not fun. It's not a good use of time to actually write boilerplate code to open this text file and change the spelling of this and analyze this and summarize it for me and create a chart. I mean, that could be a good hour or so of my life. And ChatGPT is already good at taking a free-form English explanation of a problem you want to solve, passing it some data as input, and giving you, if not the answer, at least a pretty darn good starting point. And so I commented in the chat too about an example of a colleague of mine who, for something fairly low stakes, wanted to send a demand letter to handle something in his real life and didn't, no offense, didn't want to pay for an attorney to do this for this particular task. And so he had ChatGPT write a very compelling sounding letter that he did need to tweak a bit, but there too, it was a very good starting point. And so I think there are significant productivity gains already, even though there's a lot of rough edges and things it can't do yet. Should we go to Divya if you have a question with the virtual hand?
Yes, thank you, David. Thank you, Doug, for an amazing presentation. So I'm a practicing advocate at Supreme Court of India, and I would like to ask you a question which is related to demography. When we are talking about law and legal professionals, we have a tendency of not changing to technology immediately. We try and wait for rules and regulations to be in place. So when we are talking about all these changes in legal professions, when ChatGPT is there, when AI is there, when generative AI is there, where do you see the difference which will be there in developing and underdeveloped countries in terms of legal profession? Because all of us are not having the similar kind of resources to implement, similar kind of money to put in for AI development. Other than that, finally, when the courts are compliant, still, do you see a major difference in coming decade in terms of legal equality, I would say, worldwide? Because yes, we do see a lot of difference. Yeah, that's one question. Another small addition to this, where do you see gender equity going with this kind of technology coming into picture?
Let me loop in your first question with one that was also asked in the chat, which is about the use of this software or technology to help indigent clients. I think that this is such a, everything I say is like speculative, right? Like I have no idea where this is going. It's still so new. So take it with a grain of salt that I'm offering speculation. I think the initial responses that we have seen, regardless of where you are in the world, although a lot of our examples focus on the US because that's where we are and that's where we get a lot of our news from, seem to be very antagonistic towards AI in the legal profession. I think maybe it's who's writing it, maybe it's who's consuming it. There's fear about what this is going to do for attorneys. Is this going to replace attorneys? I think the best approach is integrating tools like the ones I discussed in the middle, which would be Harvey or Spellbook, tools that can help you. I think tools that can help you and can make better use of your time, make it possible to assist more clients, assist clients who maybe don't have the means to pay as much money, because you can use your time with them to have face-to-faces with them, to have real interactions with them, the high value, high return things, and not be charging them by the hour for the behind the scenes stuff, which is where I think a lot of bills get racked up from my time practicing. So I think to the extent that you're anywhere in the world, using these tools is obviously going to be subject to local regulations, as you alluded to. I think it's kind of incumbent upon us as attorneys trying to advocate for changes in the law to take these tools not as threats, because I think that the most outlandish things like the robot lawyers, right? That's not in the near future. Use these tools to supplement what we do to make our lives easier, much like we have done for many other developments in technology over the years. And you can extend the benefits that you are getting from these tools to your clients. I think that's true regardless of where you are in the world. And I think it's incumbent upon us to advocate for changes that make that possible so that we can help people wherever they are in the world. We can help people regardless of what they can afford to pay. In terms of, I think the second part of your question was gender equity related. That I don't know. That I feel like that would be wild speculation on my part to offer an opinion on that one. So I'm going to respectfully not, because I don't feel like I'm in a position to give a learned answer on that one.
Over to Andrew next.
Yeah, thank you. My question is about whether large language models and ChatGPT and its kind of cousins, is this the main kind of AI approach that we should be imagining is going to be taking over more things? Or what my concern is, these large language models are doing amazing things. And yes, we should understand how we can use them and how we deal with them, but that's not the only way to implement AI, right? And I presume there are many other uses. If you're a law firm or a lawyer trying to figure out how can I use machine learning and neural networks and AI, to do better work, there are other things that I might be doing, like I want a better logical system that checks the logic in my document, which is different from a large language model that's saying, what's in some sense, what's the next likely word given what everyone else has written over the last 10 years. So are we going to end up over focusing on large language models, because of all this, or is that actually appropriate because that's where much of the, fecundity of the technology is going to be in the next 5 years?
I think one way to think about it is that our focus on large language models at the tail end of today is really a lower level implementation detail. And it's where we are in terms of state of the art, in terms of implementation of the principles of artificial intelligence. Undoubtedly, this will evolve. Folks will come up with new techniques over the coming years. I think for the practical use cases you allude to, what you're seeing springing up by the day, it seems, are higher level SaaS offerings, software as a service, that are using LLMs and similar techniques that we discussed today as the underlying implementation details. But we as end users, we as attorneys, we as computer scientists, don't necessarily need to know or care about those details because, to your point, you have a more narrow focus. The appeal of LLMs right now and services like OpenAI's is that they are trying to be a very general platform that can in general understand questions or approximate understanding of them and generate responses. But the fine tuning, which was the last keyword I ended on, is really where the magic starts to happen, where you would ideally feed it in domain specific knowledge now that you've taught the AI how to understand and how to speak English, now go learn this other thing. But for now, I think the LLMs really have pushed things forward in terms of just understanding what it is we want them to hear and say back to us. See, no more hands in the air, Doug. Were there any chat questions you wanted to field? I know there's so many. I hope you'll forgive if we field just a subset. We don't want to keep folks on too much longer.
Yeah, I'm skimming through. Sorry. Some of them I just don't feel qualified to answer. There was a question about how the Supreme Court would handle something. It's like, I don't think we're at the point where we can answer that question well. Do you have any ideas or experience on how to communicate about AI to your clients? I do. I think that the first thing is, if you're going to use it, you should talk about it. I feel this way in general about using any sort of assisted technologies, not necessarily even in a legal context. Full disclosure is a good thing. Having your clients opt in to, hey, in our firm, we are currently experimenting with using these tools. I'd imagine at the outset, they're still going to be very aggressively spot checked by a human, whether that's an intern or a junior associate or something like that. Telling your clients about that, potentially incentivizing your clients to use these tools. That way you get a bigger buy-in, you get a bigger data set to look at. Step number one, I said, just be upfront about it. In terms of talking about AI, I think that kind of depends on your client. I don't think, at the beginning of today's session, we spent a lot of time talking about how they work, because I think it's important for us as practitioners to know how they work, that they're not just randomly picking text out of files and kind of glomming something together, but there's actually like this intelligence behind it. Like there is a method to the madness. I don't think that many clients need to know that low-level detail, but I think discussing how you use AI with your clients and at a very high level what it does for you, I think even just a couple sentences explaining that is good. If you're looking for what those sentences are, I think that kind of depends on how you plan to use it. And if you do have a very specific plan on how you want to use it and you don't know how to say it, I'd say shoot us an email and I'll think about how I might phrase it in the context of, for a complete layman who has no desire to really understand the technology of it other than this is what this does at a very high level. I'd be happy to try and field that for you. The other use, I think, is just for clients that you have that are in the software industry. Whether they are curious about using AI to help them or they are in the AI field themselves, I think it's just important to have conversational knowledge about it so that when they are explaining to you what they do, it's not like your eyes aren't glazing over like what's happening, which I know can definitely happen. I mean, I am in the tech field as well. And back when I was practicing, I had a client who was very techy and was getting really deep in the weeds about what they were doing. And it's like, man, I got to read up on this stuff a lot more because I can't advise them well without understanding fully what they're trying to do. So having this knowledge, I think, is beneficial as well for working with clients who are in software. But just disclosing upfront what you do or how you would use it, I think, is a good thing. Let me scroll down a little bit further. Someone asked earlier, and I put this in the chat in case you're not paying attention to the chat, a good source for news on this. So I really recommend TechCrunch. It's a little nerdy, but at the same time, I also find its content very digestible, and it covers a lot of different, right now, a lot of its coverage is AI related because it is so buzzy in our field right now. But as a great news source that doesn't get too deep in the weeds, but gives opportunities to dig deeper if you'd like, I definitely recommend that as a potential news source for a trustworthy, relatively balanced discussion of the developments in AI and how to go.
And funny enough, the top headline is about Samsung banning use of generative AI tools like ChatGPT. And Doug, maybe one final question from the chat that you could perhaps answer better that seems representative of a class of questions. On some level, the question is, why is this any different from Westlaw or Lexis or any other software anyone might use to advise them of the law?
That's a great question. I was actually, in my draft of these slides, I actually had a discussion of Westlaw and Nexus and LexisNexis. I don't know if it necessarily is that different, right? In some ways, it's you ask it a question, and in Westlaw or Nexus, are you doing this with kind of cryptic keywords or searches and ors, and you're trying to come up with a search query string that looks good to target what you're going for. Here, you can be much more natural language and ask it to do things. So I think as a research tool, it's not different. It's where it starts to become a drafting tool and offering not legal advice, but legal advice. That's where it gets different. As a research tool, I think you could absolutely use GPT in a very similar way. Can you give me a list of cases in the 8th Circuit about whatever topic, right? Other than it being a lot more natural to type that sentence out than put together a Westlaw search query, that's not that different. If you ask it to write you a amicus brief for some case, I think that's where it starts to get weird, right? So it really just depends on how you are planning to use these tools. I think that is where, at this point in the game, we have to draw the line. If you're using it purely to be a better way to research something, I'm not sure that's something that really even needs to be disclosed, as long as you're presumably verifying and checking all of your work anyway. It's when you start to nudge it in the direction of doing a little bit of your work for you, getting the first draft of something out, that's where it gets a little bit more gray area, I think, in terms of where things stand today and in terms of how we regulate or look at it today.
All right, we want to be mindful of the time here. Allow me to paste one last time today's slides. We'll also follow up via email with a link to the video if you or a colleague might have missed some or all of today. Our thanks again to our friends at the Exec Ed program for bringing everyone together and making this possible. So glad everyone here could join us. And Doug, any final remarks before we let folks drop off?
No, I want to say thank you all for joining us. I hope that you learned a lot about how these things work. I see a lot of names in the chats from people who are currently enrolled in CSL. It's nice to see a face to the name. It's always nice to put a face to the name when I see your work come in. So thank you for joining us. And again, if you have any questions, feel free to shoot us emails and we'll do our best to field them. But yeah, this was a lot of fun, and thank you for joining us today.
Have a wonderful morning, afternoon, or night. Take care.
Take care.